seat. Good evening. My name is Dick Cavanaugh. I'm the Executive Dean of the Kennedy School and the Acting Director of the Center for Business and Government. Each organization is co-sponsoring this, so I guess I'm the co-sponsor. I'm delighted you're here, and I'm delighted to introduce Ken Omai, who is going to be our speaker tonight. Ken is really kind of a Renaissance man. He was trained as a nuclear engineer, where he holds a PhD from MIT. He is the chairman of McKinsey & Company of Japan and is responsible for the Pacific Basin practice of McKinsey & Company. By the way, for those of you who are not familiar with McKinsey & Company, it is not a sex research institute, as some sometimes describe it, but rather a management consulting outfit where I once worked. Ken is the author of 30 books, or is it more? 36, I'm told. So I'm only off by 20%. Virtually all of his books have been best-selling books in Japan. Many of them have been best-selling books around the world. They include titles like The Mind of the Strategist, Beyond National Borders, and so forth. Most importantly to me, Ken supervised the translation of my book into Japanese. Ken has been an advisor to multinational corporations around the world, to governments around the world. He always says important things, often says controversial things. Typically, when he says these things, people pay large sums of money to hear them. But tonight, it's free. So let me introduce my friend Ken Omai.
Thank you, Dick. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to come to the campus of the Kennedy School, first time in my life. I didn't expect this kind of configuration. And I'm told that this is a large audience, which I can't see. You would have expected a Jane Fonda or someone like that. I don't want to disappoint the audience, so I might do the same kind of trick as she does, but maybe later, depending on the outcome of the presidential election. The subject I like to talk about is the coming shape of the world. My secretary made a small technical mistake. This afternoon, I gave a speech at the B School, which should have been on the subject of global competition. And the Kennedy School should have been the coming shape of the region state. Now it's reversed. So you guys have seen the announcement as the global competition, which should have been the subject of the B School. But that's all right. I can talk about business or the political situation. The reason being, in Japan, I'm in the process of forming a new political process, which will take over the majority party and will eventually, govern that country. So we'll talk about that later. It's a fun process, but don't confuse me, because I'm short, with Ross Perot's. Very different, very different process. First, I'd like to talk about the emerging shape of the world as the national borders are becoming a little bit lower than traditional sort of nation-state notion, formation of European community, and discussion on the NAFTA would suggest the lowering, certainly, of the national borders. What will then happen when Europe 92 comes in January 1 of next year, and NAFTA is implemented through 1999? And my assertion is that region state will emerge. And before we talk about region state, I'd like to ask you your definition of the nation state. In Kennedy School, do you define what you mean by a nation? And I'm very curious about your definition of the nation state. Because if you can describe the nation state, which encompasses the United States all the way to Seychelles and Vanuatu, and sort of be comprehensive, consistent, I would be very impressed. The notion of nation state, as you know, is only maybe 1.5 centuries old. And we thought we knew what the nation state is all about. And the best definition I could come up with is that nation states are those which United Nations recognized as nation states, right? Because Taiwan is not a nation state. Taiwan is not a member, therefore it's not a nation state. Sort of a tautology, right? China is a nation state because the United Nations has accepted them. We didn't think North Korea was a nation state, but now they are, because along with Southern Korea, that they have become the members of the United Nations, and therefore they must be a nation. What about Russian Republic? What about Georgia? What about Lithuania? Well, we don't know, because the Soviet Union used to vote once. Now it seems like they could vote 14 times, depending on what they want. What about Yugoslavia? How many votes do they have? Nobody knows. What is a nation state? We in Japan grew up in a typical nation state sort of backdrop. So Japan, for the sake of the Japanese, the Japanism is prevailing. And we have never doubted the single notion of Japan as a country. Is that right? Don't know. United States. Well, what is a United States? It seems to me that the formation of NAFTA is going to create a problem along the borderlines between Canada and the United States. Because such a country as Canada, with long borderlines with the United States, will suffer from this notion of nation state. Canada, well, it is a country that is not a United States. You have to define Canada as something by saying that it is not the United States. And it is a country with 2 languages, French and English. People in British Columbia will say, why do we need to learn French? Because there are more Chinese in Vancouver. And we very seldom bump into the French-speaking situation. And yet the primary education dictates that the country is bilingual to begin with. And that is fine so long as they want to encompass the state called Quebec. But does it really matter when the NAFTA is fully implemented? Similar questions would come up with parts of Texas, parts of California, with Mexico. What is happening is, like in Europe, the same time European community is forming the single market, national borders are lowering, emergence of region states, such as Catalonia, as an autonomous, independent sort of region within Spanish national borders. Lombardy League, 3 states in the northern Italian region, quite capable of competing in the EC context, but is fed up of supporting southern states to its eternity and South not making its own efforts, as they claim, could be a problem. Likewise, future of Vancouver could rest much better with a city, state like Seattle, as opposed to finding communal interest with Nova Scotia or Quebec. Likewise, the city of San Diego, where do they belong to? When only 50 kilometers south of it is a very attractive region, Tijuana, in which there will be an international airport capable of dealing with the rest of the world, when the city itself is incapable of even building the airport to land 747. So the formation of the region states, as opposed to sticking to the traditional notion of the United States, the Canada, and the Mexico, would make sense. You don't hear any of this in the presidential debate. United States, despite its good intention of giving regional autonomy to each state, and therefore the role of the federal government has been that of the catalytic or coordinating role. If you listen to these presidential candidates, you would think these candidates come from Japan, that the federal or central government controls everything. They speak as if they are in charge of everything, which is a big departure from the Paris Treaty some 200 years ago. So I wonder what is happening in this country. For example, if you listen to the presidential debate, they seem to be of the opinion that the president of the federal United States can change the country, as opposed to asking each autonomous regions to take a charter to develop the vision for their future on their own. Federal is a catalytic function at best. I don't see any debate in these presidential elections. Candidates talk about the need for regions, Pacific Northwest or Midwest, start to survive in the global economy, which they must. I don't think Washington knows the answer to these situations, because most of the things Washington hears is the either declining states or declining industry complaints. Successful companies don't complain, therefore they don't get the fair share of the voice in Washington, certainly. And therefore, if you listen to the federal government, you would think the presidential candidates can really make a big difference to this country called the United States. And I question that. I question the ability of the central government to make any difference unless you have a self-propelling engines and locomotives in these regions. I can see Southern California prospering because they have a perfect relationship with the rest of the world on its own vision, but still staying in touch with the Union. Midwestern United States could have its own vision, and for a while I thought North Carolina had the global vision. 1/3 of that state's investment came from Japan, another third came from Europe. And they were trying to solve some of their low employment problems by giving high-tech, high-skilled workforce to these foreign investors. But now everyone seems to be relying on the federal budget to solve their problems, even when Hurricane Andrew hit Florida. People are saying, oh, we need federal funds to fix this mess. And I can understand this. If you look at the US tax structure, nothing has changed over time between the state and federal, except that the federal has the ability to mint these greenbacks freely. So each year they mint a little bit more than the state share, thereby they have 400 billion surplus printing capacity, and therefore de facto federal portion has become larger by borrowing from the future, from foreign countries. Federal budget has become larger without changing the rule, without changing the fundamental division of labor between federal and the state. Anyway, I'd like to ask you to think about the role of the federal government in otherwise a borderless world, in which the region states seem to be the natural unit of autonomy, and that autonomous regions around the world seem to be forming with 5 to 20 million people. It seems to me that that is a very viable economic unit. If you had a population of 5 to 20 million people, you could deal with the rest of the world. Do you know of the smallest OECD nation? That is Iceland. Icelandic population is 252,000. And that country is a member of OECD and is sending ambassadors to quite a few countries, not all of them, and sending members to OECD office in Paris. And because they want to take great pride in its own independence, not ruled by the Danes or the Norwegians, they want to survive in this world, which they can. They have one of the highest per capita GNPs in the world by catching and selling fish. Our fishermen in Japan, shame on them. They get every taxpayer's subsidies and support for construction of the harbors from the Tokyo and Osaka taxpayers, never paid tax, by the way, and never even thought about sending ambassadors to the rest of the world. And our fishermen are taking the surface of the Bay of Tokyo, Bay of Osaka, away from the good Sunday afternoon of the Tokyo-Osaka residents. They take up the surface of the ocean in the name of the fishing rights. In fact, in Japan, only 3 prefectures out of 45 are paying tax in excess of their own consumption. 42 are net recipients of tax dollars coming from big cities. They are so dependent on Tokyos and Osakas of this world, they don't even make efforts. What they do is go to Tokyo, try to get a little bureaucrat come to become the assistant mayor of the city so that the tax dollar will come in and flow in their direction more and more. The dependence is like almost a delinquent children. And you try to educate them, but before you can educate them, they beg you more. And then your parental feeling is to give them more, and therefore it's a permanent vicious cycle of dependency. Japanese regional autonomy is near zero. In this way, Tokyo people will suffer from underinvestment, traffic congestions, long commuting, 70 square meters of housing, which is not really big enough to accommodate 4-member family to give them to give each of them a room. therefore creating a tremendous dissatisfaction for people, and yet the local people at the receiving end of these guys' tax money will not make any efforts. Japan was a very efficient central system until recently, until they achieved $10,000 per capita GNP. It had a tremendous education system to silence people so that the little bit of luxury is interpreted as real luxury, and people are very happy. But this is changing because these guys are now fatigued. They have to commute long distance, and they can't accommodate their grandfathers and mothers in their own household. Younger guys coming in to the workforce, fresh out of good schools, will not have a hope for having a house, right? Within the reasonable commuting distance of 3 hours round trip to office, and even private room for husband for study or children. Therefore, I think we have hit the end of this traditional success recipe, Japan Inc., educating people to be happy with little they receive and keep working. Because the rest of the world is saying, hey, you guys are very successful, and yet your lifestyle is not improving. And if you look at the root cause of this, it is because LDP, the leading Democratic Party, is allied with special interest groups, not with the majority of its people. And the stupid Socialist Party still supporting outdated ideology, and Union, which doesn't support the socialist ideologies, but because of the historical reasons, still pumping in money. So there is no party in the center of the road. Our LDP is supported by special interest groups. Take doctors. Medical Association is a mighty lobbyist group in Japan. They donate a lot of money. And government, which is a supplier government, they construct, supply, give, typical of the developing country. And today, they are pumping out more doctors than we need. So in order for the doctors to keep the current lifestyle, we have to invent disease. We have to make sure that patients will stay longer in the hospital. And once they are sick, they will never come out of the hospital. So our medical profession is just like your law school. You know, once you have a problem, you'll be either in the jail or trying to come out of the jail, but in the process takes a long time. So you have done this in the law school with lawyers, what we are doing in the medical school. Same is true with the construction ministry. They are constructing highways in the remotest locations of Japan, where only 30 cars pass the toll gate a day. Forget about the congestions in Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya. You see, they are still constructing because their lobbyists argue for more construction. And construction capital, USA is asking Japan to spend more money on the infrastructure building. But sure, the Japanese LDP will accept that because each dollar spent in public works, 1/1000th of that money comes back into kanemaru faction. So that's a political laundry machine perfected in Japan, and therefore every time you have a public spending, there's a sure kickback. LDP benefits. Foreign pressure is a very convenient way of some of these special interest groups getting their benefit. If Cray Research pushes for sale of supercomputer, it becomes a Recruitgate scandal, as you know. And if they push for more infrastructure building of sewage and highways, sure, we'll do it because it's beneficial. If U.S. demands that the Japanese stock market should not drop because this is not good right in front of the presidential election, if the Tokyo stock Nikkei goes down to 12,000, it could trigger a panic in New York through stock and bond market. So Diamonds and Greenspans of this world say, don't do it. Well, we pump in $70 billion to it, and of course, we can alleviate some of these problems for a while. But the real problem of Japanese financial system is that it will have to collapse. Crash of Tokyo market is inevitable. Crash of Tokyo, however, is going to be preceded by the crash of US bond market. It is no longer Japan versus the United States. These two economies are so interlinked that, of course, Reagan wanted to borrow money from Japan, and we have $1 trillion in the United States. So before the Japanese banks go under, they have to retrieve the money, because that's what the stockholders would demand. Before they declare bankruptcy, they have to get the money back from the United States, which I can guarantee you is going to kaput the US bond market, what we call USGS, government securities. That will trigger a crash of New York market. And then political guys will say, oh, Japan did it. No, it is the Reagan who wanted to borrow money, and we can't blame him. You know, he's gone. But you can't have a nirvana, you know, forever. You have to spend within the limits of your earning capability, and if you didn't do that, someday, sooner or later, you have to catch up with it, or facts will catch up with it. And the facts are that the Japanese money that is sitting in the United States need to be recalled, because we are now awakening from the nightmares or nirvana of the bubble. And Tokyo is the problem. Tokyo property market is the biggest problem in today's world financial market. Price of Tokyo's real estate is bigger than the entire United States. Everyone knows that. But few people know that the real value of Tokyo today has come down 60% since the peak of 1.5 years ago, or December, so 2 years ago. But the real market adjustment has been only 17%. So additional 40% will have to come down. But if you look at the commercial buildings, it's even worse, because over the next 3 years, through 1995, some 80 million square feet of new modern buildings, office space, will be added to Tokyo. Wow. We have a historical high of vacancy rates of 3%. We are already discounting 20% for rents. But at 15% vacancy rates, which you can calculate, because these buildings are under construction, and we know for sure they will come on stream. Okay? At that point, the rents could come down by 40%. And therefore, the net present value of these properties could go down as low as 20% of the peak. Okay? Who is going to adjust for that? Government says, oh, this is presidential election. We can't do this now. So September closing of the book prolonged by changing the rule. For example, Ministry of Finance said, oh, you don't have to write off the debts this term, next term. Non-performing debts? We changed the definition of non-performing loans. So long as the main bank is interested in paying for the interest, it's okay. Otherwise, non-performing debts were defined as those whose interest haven't been paid for 6 months. Now we changed the definition because we don't want to disturb Mr. Bush. This is bad, you see, because if it happens 8 weeks before his election, we get the blame for it. So we have changed the rules, and we survived through the end of September, but we can't survive forever, okay? Because non-performing loans are now $210 billion, counting only good ones, which is the main bank. But then we have many non-bank banks doing this. So we don't know how deep it is, but one thing we know for sure is that financial institutions will collapse in Japan, and it is because of the Tokyo's property. Is it bad or good? Politicians say it's disaster. I say it's very good, because that way the property will become a normal price, and people can afford to build a large house, shorter commuting, triple lines for commuters, large shopping malls, and parking lots, so long as we change the government to deregulate everything. We have to change the government because this government that exists in Japan will still favor these special interest groups. But if they truly believed in people interest, I think we are in for major reconstruction of Japan, particularly through housing. Long overdue. Healthy demand, consumption. And commuting will be easier, housing will be better, and Bay Area will be opened up for the 31 people in the metropolitan area instead of a small number of fishermen, and New Japan will emerge. So this is a tremendous opportunity. We should let that crash happen, and I'm sorry it will affect the United States because we are so interlinked. New York will crash, bond will crash, everything else, but you can blame Mr. Reagan for it. You can't blame the Japanese because we're in this together. It's almost, American pilot controlling the hydraulics of the Japanese plane and vice versa. We can't say that this is US versus Japan. It is one economy. After all, what I call ILE, interlinked economy. Interlinked economy of the developed world. And that's why it is time for us to put our attention to the interlinkage of the economies and all these relationships across national borders. At the same time, recognize the emergence of these region states. In between is this funny unit called nation states. And yet those nation states and their governments are backing up special interest groups specifically. At worst, many of them pointing their own guns against their own people. I have seen more instances of these governments using their military force against them, against their own people. So what is a nation state? What is the positive role of the nation states? And why is it that these modern nation states fail to serve the majority interest? And they normally end up serving the special interest groups. I don't know. I thought I could find the answer in Kennedy School. But at best, I wanted to share with you my view of what's happening in the world, and perhaps you could ask questions, raise issues, because nobody knows the answer, what the future will hold for. But these are very important times in which the old world is dead, but the new world hasn't been born. And I think we together owe it to the rest of the world to jointly picture the shape of the world to come and shape of the governments, quasi-governments, regional autonomous governments, and the role of the corporations, role of the people to be defined anew. This is as good a place as I can think of to start that kind of thinking, instead of US pointing their guns at Japan and say, you guys do this and that, otherwise we will hold you against Super 301, etc. It's not the time. That's a 19th century modus operandi. In the future, everyone will be hurt if you did use that old nation-state model. If Japan stuck to the northern islands, if Japan held its own traditional view of Japan for the sake of Japan, likewise, United States, sticking to this federal supremacy over a region or US hegemony over other regions. So I like to sort of get your reaction to my view, and I like to sort of encourage discussions to start in this direction. This is the best time because in Japan we are undergoing through a major soul searching. Traditional government is going to fall because they are not supported clearly by the majority interest. And in the United States, it looks as though the government is going to change. Couldn't be a better time, couldn't be a better place. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ken. I always had wondered why President Bush fainted on his trip to Tokyo, but hearing your remarks about financial apocalypse, I now understand. I would also remind this audience that the last time we had a person here who claimed that he might create a new political movement was last February, when there was a short man with big ears from Texas who spoke to this group, and in response to a question from the audience about had he ever thought about running for president, answered with a question which is, well, do you think I should? That's Mr. Perot. Let me give the ground rules for questions from the audience. There are microphones both here, and is there one back there as well tonight? No, there are microphones to my right and left here. The ground rule is that a question can take no longer than 45 seconds, and it must end with a question mark. The question can be, given Ken's remarks, can be about any number of topics. It can be about nation states, it can be about Japanese politics, it can be about the coming financial disasters of the world, it can come on the subject of the posters that said that this was about global competition. It can be on any range of subjects, but it must take no longer than 45 seconds to deliver and must end with a question mark. So if we could have people who would come to the microphones and ask their questions, my job is to try to be the air traffic controller, and in typical Kennedy School format, we will begin from the left.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you to help clarify what I see as a conflict between the notion of the nation state in a global economy with the notion of a country. I think you aptly advanced the idea that the notion of a nation state is having a hard time being reconciled in light of a borderless economic environment. And yet on the other hand, it seems like the notion of country. You talked about Quebec, you talk about Yugoslavia, you talk about Mexico. The power of culture seems to be working at right angles with this emergence of this global economy. How do you reconcile the notion of country with the notion of nation state? Question mark.
How do I reconcile? Well, Japan is the best example. My suggestion in the newly formed policy board is to suggest to break up Japan into 10 pieces. And if you do that, you have reasonably autonomous Kyushu worrying about its relationship with Korea, China, Taiwan, etc. While Hokkaido, the northern state, is looking after the development of Sakhalin and coastal Russia. Now, therefore, it doesn't require Japan to have a central national policy because they will find their own relationship with the neighboring countries and regions. And therefore, together, they will form a league similar to the Hanseatic League that existed in Europe years ago. And that is a much more natural form of economy, which, by the way, existed some 20 centuries ago. So what I'm suggesting is that we will experiment more autonomous states by giving them legislative and administrative power to Kyushu. And Mr. Hiramatsu, governor of Oita, will head up the Kyushu legislative body, and Tokyo will cease to function as the nation state except for its coordinating role. In a way, Japanese government will become a joint venture of these 10 autonomous regions. So that way, we will be paying tax in a very different way. Currently, 70% of tax goes to the central government. They distribute. My proposal is to go through the community and the region, and then government receives only 5 points of its total 25 points. And they will have to look after ODA, diplomacy, and defense, etc., within that budget, which regions dictate. It's a very different mode. I don't think there will be a conflict because we will not have a similar kind of central government at that time. And by the way, we have 800 congressmen today in Tokyo, both upper house and lower house. There are so many of them, individual members, so unimportant. And they are like a salaried man. And therefore, the only raison d'etre for them is to carry back some money from the center to the local to build bridges and gymnasiums, and they become a lobbyist in a way. I am proposing to reduce that number to 100. If we had only 100 at the center, they will worry about Japan and the world and not worry about how to take money back to their own region. Let's get parts of this world.
Mr. Oma, I wanted to ask you a question about the beginning of your talk and link it to the work you've done on multinationals. You've talked a lot about multinationals as needing to be insiders in each of the various triad blocks, which I interpret as meaning getting larger and establishing bases in each of these regions. To me, that seems like then the firms may be getting larger, and yet we know that lean production techniques are also meaning that small firms can niche and be active players in the economy as well. So it seems there may be a pressure to large firms and both small firms. And you've said, I think, basically the same thing about nation states, that they're withering away, and there's a role for regional blocks in terms of some government functions, but there's also a role for small units, you know, Silicon Valley and so on and so forth, in terms of the functions at the local level. Is there an underlying dynamic that's causing this top and bottom in terms of size, both in firms and states?
Very insightful question. I think in an organization, if it's too large, you have to organize by function. Japan was organized by function. Ministry of Health and Welfare created doctors, education created teachers, and construction created asphalt jungle. So those are functional organizations. Any company becoming too large with functional organization will then think about operating divisions, a unit to give away the autonomy. You see, therefore, General Electric is no longer organized by producers and sellers. They are organized around more natural business units to which they delegate authority. What I'm looking for is a unit to give the autonomy so that they feel that they have all the authorities they need to operate and make money and help themselves. And what we are looking for is a unit which will start thinking about how they can help themselves. Okay, if it's a small regional unit, small like Shikoku, 4 million people, maybe too small, they have to think about their own raison d'etre in the context of the 700 million people triad market. Singapore has succeeded with 2.5 million people by globalizing their economy, inviting corporations to come in, and then exporting their products to all these developed regions, and thereby relating themselves much better with the rest of the world. They could prosper and achieve $10,000 per capita GNP in 20 years' time. I would suggest that both corporations, which are very small, and also regions, which is subcritical, to start thinking about linking themselves with the rest of the world, because the nation is not going to help them. Nation state is not going to help them because there are many other important regions for them politically. But as I said, Iceland, with only 252,000 people, start thinking about linking with the rest of the world, they can keep $15,000 per capita GNP, pretty good standard of living. They cannot achieve that in isolation. The only reason they can achieve that is by allowing people to import the best and the cheapest from anywhere in the world, allowing free mechanisms to come in, thereby improving the standard of living, quality of life, and yet exporting to the most attractive markets in the world. And therefore, this market mechanism, both for the company and the region, works in a similar way. And that's why when I was the economic advisor to Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia, or before that, I was advisor to EDB of Singapore, I used the corporate model for these countries. Malaysia is a 13 million people country with $3,000 per capita GNP. In my opinion, for that country to prosper and for people to become happy, I thought if they excelled in 3 industrial sectors, became global, they could support that. Because some of our largest clients, McKinsey and Company, was bigger than Malaysia, right? And clearly, that was achieved either through producing only cars or audiovisual system. And therefore, my idea was for that country to become a little bit less dependent on primary commodities, but become excellent in only 3 segments, vertically very strong, like in chips. Not just assembly of chips, but you produce lead frame, silicon, etc., so that the whole infrastructure is in the place. Therefore, if the currency switched, producers will not go to China because there is the whole infrastructure, and therefore there is a benefit of being in Malaysia. If you are just lending labor force, cheap and transient, companies come in and go out, no good. Therefore, becoming truly competitive in 3 segments of the market, I thought they would be able to compete in the world marketplace and make those 13 million people reasonably content. And that's why I would use these corporate models that you described in this world marketplace. The world market, 700 million people in the world have $10,000 or more per capita GNP, which means $7,000 per capita is discretionary. Engel's coefficient, which is the basic minimum that you have to use for living, it's only 30%. So $7,000 is discretionary, which means that times 700 million is discretionary, which means depending on what you invent, what you offer, that purse could shift in your way or come in your way. That's the beauty of this free market mechanism. Imagination, creativity, your dedication to the customer is everything. And it's open to the Australians coming from remote locations in the down under, open to Venezuelans, open to the Brazilians, because they don't care. So long as it's the best and cheapest, originating in anywhere in the world, they would choose. Just as we buy Reebok sneakers. They're here, right? They are headquartered in this area, but we all think it's a British product because of the brand, but it's manufactured in Korea, now going to China because it's cheaper. Well, that's the nature of the product, you see? And if you can franchise these customers with the idea of Reebok or Nike, that's what you need. You could be a Nike coming from New Zealand. You could be a Nike coming from Iceland, you see? And you could be a Rupert Murdoch coming from Australia, but could be a dominant player in Hollywood, which is a nationality-less village anyway. You see, that's why I like this model, because eventually it is fair, because it awards people with talent, efforts, imagination, and it probably punishes people who don't want to survive in this otherwise very prosperous marketplace. The wealth has shifted from the military power, natural resources, have nations, to the marketplace. And the choice of these people, of 700 million people, is really the key to success.
Do you see that the financial and economic collapse that you're anticipating will increase the likelihood of major wars? After all, the Depression of the 30s preceded World War II.
I don't think the history will repeat itself. You know, today we are living in a fundamentally different world. The value system of the Japanese youngsters, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore youngsters, even Korean youngsters are not very different from California youngsters. And therefore, unlike those days where governments could put blame on somebody else, totalitarian regime could emerge, I don't think so. The beauty of the power of the information era, CNN and many other things coming into your living room, is that government has lost their ability to fool their people. Well, CNN can still fool people, but that's a different matter. So the ability of the government to dictate to its own people what's right and what's wrong, and make them even fanatic about certain ideologies, is gone. Because government can no longer monopolize the information. And therefore, I don't see any danger of war. I think after that collapse, the sovereignty of people will resume, and all the fashioned efforts by the government to put the blame on something else will be ridiculed. And therefore, I think this will be a victory of technology, victory of the people. And I think in that sense, there is a fundamental difference from those days to today. There are rhetoric that politicians like to use, and in fact, journalists, which still live in the 19th century national hegemonial model, but the bulk of the people know better, in my opinion. and this includes the Japanese. And I'm sure the Germans, much better than the Japanese this time around.
Hi, my name is Mikiko Sawanishi. I'm MPP student. I came from Japan, and I was working for Japanese government before coming here. Maybe you hate me. No way. My question is very broad. I agree with the declining notion of declining nation states. And maybe it's in some sense the limitation of sovereignty of nation states. I'm thinking at the same time the role of international organization is going to be very important. And my question is how Japan should play the role in international organization, mainly in terms of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building.
My opinion is that Japan should first change its constitution. I have proposed a new constitution for Japan, and I have published this book. This book sold 600,000 copies, so you can't ignore it. Thomas Jefferson was able to write something like that. Why not me? Why not you? Well, we should all write these things. My point is we should change the Constitution so that we can safeguard peacekeeping efforts. Right now, the Constitution says we can't rearm. Having that Article 9, we have one of the mightiest militaries in the world, is a dichotomy. It's just crazy as hell. We don't have a civilian control mechanism because we don't accept the fact that we have a military. Therefore, anything is possible under the current law and under the current approach of LDP to interpret and change the interpretation from never do it again, I'm sorry, gomen nasai, all the way to, yeah, we can send some people to Cambodia. Same article. So I don't think we should trust the Japanese who says that the current constitution is capable of sending troops overseas if it's for peacekeeping purpose. Who is it to define that this is a peacekeeping purpose? Again, the government. Who trusts the judgment of the government? Only 18 months ago, this nation sent 600,000 troops to Middle East, and now that same person is suffering from the overhang of that action. I don't think we in Japan have a legitimate legal framework to have a large military force. I don't think we have a trust-based relationship with the rest of the world, particularly with our neighbors. I don't think we have other countries participating in our policy planning so that they can trust our own process. And therefore, I am not in favor of the current mode of Japanese government's ability or willingness to send troops overseas. Furthermore, we send these troops at the request of United Nations. Well, let's go back to my remark number one. What is a nation? When you don't know what you mean by a nation, what is a United Nations? It's an assembly of what you don't know. Okay? So when that United Nations come to Japan and says, please send us 1,500 troops, what does that mean? Gulf War, the lessons of Gulf War is that United States could hijack UN. Right? UN forced United Nations to say US decision is synonymous with United Nations decision. So we are not sure, I'm not sure, what United Nations is now, today, particularly when Soviets could be 13 countries, China could be 30, Yugoslavia could be 5, and we could end up with having 300. What does majority voting mean in the United Nations? Is there just in that organization? Is it worthwhile for Japan to send its latest military weapons, troops, to kill somebody or safeguard somebody else in the name of what? I think United Nations need to be redefined. It is time for us to think about reorganization of United Nations, and we have to think about world problems first in environmental issues, security issues, and economic issues. And let the capable, able nations to take care of those special councils, like Special Council, Security Council, Environmental Council, Economic Council. And then reform the General Assembly, not as an assembly of the so-called nation states, but group of people, human beings. Therefore, it is, if it's a problem for Timor, and the Indonesian government doesn't want them to come to the UN, we like to hear what they are thinking about. We want to hear directly what the Kurds are thinking about. We want to hear about the opinions of Northern Ireland people. We want to hear about people. Every time we have a conflict with a group of people against the ruling government, they should be represented in that General Assembly newly defined, because after all, we are interested in human being. And if a group of human beings are oppressed, suppressed, and avoided by the ruling nation state pointing their guns at them, we like to hear. It's our interest. And therefore, General Assembly should not be the assembly of the nation states, but should be the assembly of subcultures, groups, whose points of view are not heard directly by people like yourselves. We need to hear, because we're interested in people, not the nation, defined by United Nations itself. So that's just a very difficult subject described in brief statements, but you see what I'm talking about. I think we have to redefine the United Nations. Otherwise, United Nations become a tyranny by the countries which are accepted by the members and whose membership is very arbitrary. When a country like Taiwan is not a member, when Vanuatu and Seychelles are the members, and yet, we are not hearing all the agonies, problems, anxieties, and conflicts of group of people of human race on Earth. We ought to be interested in them. You see, that's why I like to propose an overhaul of United Nations. And if UN is incapable of doing it because of the sponsoring nations, we ought to recreate something of this kind. And I have proposed that in my article that is submitted. I don't know if it is accepted by Foreign Affairs.
To the left. Ken.
Yes.
こんばんは。
こんばんは。
In a world of these autonomous regions, central governments, as I understand it, would not have the power to redistribute the wealth of a nation state, for example, to poorer regions within that nation state. What happens then to individuals in poorer autonomous regions throughout the world who lack either the information or the mobility to improve their situation on their own?
If you believe in Adam Smith and the invisible hand, and if you look at what happened to Germany before its integration of the East, that doesn't happen. Because if it's within the same framework of political system, economic system, poor regions become more attractive because they have higher unemployment and lower wage in a natural market mechanism. Therefore, corporations trying to locate the next operation will find that location much more attractive. And that's precisely what happened to Germany. Because if you look at the German shift of industrial gravity, it has gravitated toward the poorer and poorer states within the Bundesrepublik. And today, the difference of per capita GNP across is only plus minus 5%. Whereas if you do it by central mechanism, the difference of per capita GNP in Japan and Italy of poor and the rich are over a factor of 2, and the rich regions still continue to pump in. So you have to believe in the efforts that these, what you call the poor regions, make, and invisible hand will work over decades, not by year, but over a decade's time. And that is the power of education. You have to have an educational system, and you have to have reasonably enlightened people. But that's what the nation state, if they have any role, ought to do. And if you do that basics, then the rest should not go through the subsidies and things like that, but it will take care of itself. Germany has proven that to be the case. Japan and Italy have proven miserably that the central system, recycling, doesn't work.
Omae-san, konbanwa.
Konbanwa.
Eventually, the whole question will be in Japanese, but I was sitting there thinking perhaps I shouldn't have migrated to the U.S. and stayed back in India because things couldn't crash any further. On a serious note.
So invest in India.
Yeah.
It's safe.
If the if the ILE crash, or not if, when the ILE crash happens, what would the impact be on the LDCs? And the recent fall of Kanemaru, is that the beginning or a signal of the long, painful adjustment process in Japan, and then the concurrent beginning of our painful period?
Yep. Well, let's talk about the mechanism of this crash that I described at the beginning. It will take the crash of the U.S. bond first, because that's where we will pull out our money first. That's the most liquid and lucrative instruments that we have in dollar denomination. That will trigger the crash of U.S. market, and then it would appear triggers Japanese market. Although the action is going to be triggered by certain Japanese financial institutions. I would suggest, therefore, if that happens, crash of Tokyo properties will happen as a result of those crashes, because property holders can no longer hold on to them with the collapse of the Tokyo market collapse in New York. When that happens, the first thing you should do is to learn from Professor Ito, the deregulation of the Japanese market. He is the expert of deregulation of Japanese system. Unless you deregulate, the recovery process is going to be very slow. If I were in charge, I would deregulate right away so that housing construction, which is the only hope for recovery of the economy, will be very quick. Okay, construction of railways, parking lots, supermarkets, by removing these regulations on construction of large-scale supermarkets, housing, sunshine rights, etc., we will abolish or freeze all of them. So that in Japan, unlike the United States where housing is okay, we have very poor quality housing, small, unbearable housing situation, but plenty of money in the bank. Okay? The bank may be gone by that time, but certainly we have a very good savings rate. Okay? Therefore, if you deregulate and show that this is the bottom, once this bottom is felt by people, then the boom for housing construction will take place. Instead of 70 square meters, it will be 150 square meters. Instead of 1.5 hours commuting, it will be 45 minutes. It will be a lot of construction of railways, parking lots, and supermarkets, malls, etc. So we have to deregulate right after the crash, hopefully prior to the crash. If deregulation doesn't happen, then this is going to be a slow process building up. We have no engine to lift the aircraft up again, and it will be a disaster. It will be a long process, and we need a new deal. That new deal in the 30s in the United States was a decade-long program, and it was a lot of taxpayers' money building, Tennessee valleys, etc. I think the Japanese model should be a private sector, individual housing, okay? And therefore, we should not do the New Deal. This should be a super deal.
And we're going to have to do just one more question.
Okay, one more.
Do you think that this process of regionalization is being pushed more by political agreements like EC 92 and NAFTA that are supranational and are taking away some of the power of whatever we want to define nation states as? Or do you think it's being pushed more by economic factors in terms of the change in the type of production, from moving away from mass production to niche markets and flexible specialization? What do you think is really pushing the regionalization in that sense?
45 minutes, 45 seconds, question mark at the end, right. It's both. That is, formation of NAFTA is going to force Canada to think about its integrity, Mexico to think about the benefit of NAFTA, Europeans to think about the benefits. Therefore, that is a catalytic process. On the other hand, the drivers are really the economic reality. Because if you look at what I watch in Vancouver, in my ski resort in Whistler, is an American TV. The Canadians there in British Columbia watch American TV. And what I know as a management consultant is the economic region. If I want to propagate a brand called Seiko or whatever this is, I would like to cover that region with the same network. And this is called gross rating points. And unless you have certain gross rating points, you don't have the brand recognition and service, etc., economies of scale, etc. That works very well with a region with 5 to 20 million people, with major airports linking with the rest of the world with direct flights. Therefore, transportation and communication is really the reason for optimizing that kind of market size as the region where everyone wants to invest. So you would come in because there is a good return on that investment. And that is a coherent unit of economy that is dictated for most consumer products by the electronic waves, you see. And that's why cross-border regions take place in Hong Kong with Shenzhen and Vancouver with Seattle, etc. Okay? Therefore, economic drivers that you mentioned is the sufficient condition for the investor, necessary and sufficient condition because both are happening same time. So it's not mutually exclusive. I think those are the reasons to force the formation of dotted line region states, many of which are cross-border, by nature.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you, Ken, for your provocative remarks. I'll call my broker in the morning. I want to thank you all for being here and being such a wonderful audience. As they say in New Jersey, go, the mass is ended. Good to see you. Nice to see you.
Let's say hello to the real superstar.
Yeah, I am going to come see you. Please.
Yeah, let me just give you a phone number.
A phone number. Terrific. Okay, good to see you. Oh, okay. Well, they don't change. Good. You're wonderful. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.